Why do people fail to control their impulses? Now, this question has baffled scientists for decades. Humans have the most sophisticated brain machinery of any animal on the planet, and so you might expect that they would never fail to control their impulses. Now, we know that that's not the case. Whether you look at the scientific literature or your own life, we all have problems controlling our impulses. In fact, one recent group of researchers wanted to see how often people fail. And what they did was they simply beeped people throughout the day. And they asked them a couple of simple questions. The first question was, have you tried to control your impulses since the last time that we beeped you? If participants said yes, they asked them a follow-up question. Did you succeed or did you fail? To the researchers' shock, participants failed to control their impulses 50% of the time. Now that's a lot. So one thing that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to answer this question is that we're starting from a place where we're all having problems. Now, one reason why we're having problems controlling our impulses is that we simply don't understand how self-control works. Now, in recent years, a group of researchers have proposed that one way that self-control works is as a limited energy resource. When we try to control our impulses, it draws on this common energy resource, and it becomes depleted. And what happens is when we become depleted of our self-control energy, we have less of that left over for when we have to complete a subsequent attempt at controlling our impulses. So this perspective is what's known as the limited energy resource model of self-control. Now, there are a couple of other ways to think of how self-control works. One of them is that self-control, instead of representing a limited energy resource, is more of a skill, just like any other skill that we would have. So instead of our self-control performance changing over time, our self-control should remain very consistent over time, just like with any other skill that we have. A third perspective, an alternative way of thinking of how self-control works, is that it's a knowledge resource. Now, you can think of a knowledge resource as something that becomes smarter and smarter the more that you use it. So from this perspective, the more that you use your self-control, the better off you're going to be. The more that you practice, that you use it, it doesn't deplete you, it makes you smarter, it makes you better, and you're going to have a lot more self-control success. Now, this idea that the self and our identity and our ability to control our impulses relies on a limited energy resource isn't something new. Since the beginning of psychology, researchers and theorists have thought of the mind as an energy system. All that we have to do is go back to Sigmund Freud and think of some of his early writings. Freud conceptualized the mind as a large energy system. It was a system in which people were constantly going to battle against themselves. People have instincts, drives, and motives to do things. And sometimes the things that we're driven to do, these instincts, aren't very appropriate. So we have to have other components of ourself in order to remain in agreement with what's appropriate, either from what society tells us is appropriate or based on our current beliefs. So Freud got a lot of things wrong in his life. And one thing that he got wrong was why we control our impulses. But he was completely right that our mind functions as an energy system. So if we're going to try to understand why people fail to control their impulses so often, we have to understand how self-control works. And now what we're going to do is we're going to see how these three different perspectives on self-control work out. within the context of some classic experiments. Let's look at two experiments that have tested the limited resource model of self-control. The first experiment is the classic cookie and radish experiment. College students came into a laboratory and they sat down at a table. They parked their backpacks and then they received some instructions. The experimenter told them that this experiment was about taste testing, and so they were going to taste some foods and then complete some unrelated tasks. Next, half of the participants were given special instructions. They were shown a plate of food, and the plate contained two different types of food. On one side of the plate, there were chocolate chip cookies, and the experimenters had just baked them. They smelled delicious. On the other half of the plate, there were radishes, and for these participants, the experimenter told them, you can have as many of those radishes as you want to, but do not eat those chocolate chip cookies. The idea was that it would take a lot of self-control to resist eating these tempting foods. The other half of the participants had a much easier time of it. The experimenter told them the opposite. They said, eat as many of those chocolate chip cookies as you want to, but do not eat those radishes. So the idea was that for half of these participants, they would become depleted of their mental energy because they had to resist temptation. Next, what the experimenters did was they measured participants' self-control. And to do this, they gave them a series of puzzles to solve. But what they didn't tell these participants is that the puzzles were unsolvable. Persistence in the face of failure is a core feature of self-control. And so what the experimenters did was they simply wanted to see how long participants persisted. As they predicted, participants who had resisted temptation, who had become depleted of their mental energy, they persisted for a lower amount of time compared to participants whose self-control energy had not been depleted. So next, what the experimenters wanted to do was conduct a second study to not only replicate what they had found, but also to extend it in a different way. This is what's known as the white bear study. So participants came into a laboratory, they sat down at a table, and they were told to write a brief essay. Now, for half of these participants, they were simply told to write an essay using normal, everyday activities and words and no special instructions. But the other half of the participants, they got those instructions, but then there was a key switch. For these participants, the experimenter told them, whatever you do when you're writing your essay, do not think of a white bear. If you catch yourself thinking of a white bear, get that thought out of your head. Suppress the idea of a white bear. So for these participants, they had to exert a lot of self-control, because anytime you tell people not to do something, they do it more. And it would take self-control to do that, to suppress thoughts of a white bear, and that might deplete people's mental energy. What the researchers found was that suppressing thoughts of a white bear did wear people out and made them mentally exhausted. And the reason they knew that is because those participants later on showed the poorest self-control. So whether it's resisting tempting food or trying to suppress thoughts of a white bear, our ability to control our impulses is fragile. It's based on a limited energy resource. So when we use that, we become depleted. And we suffer in terms of our ability to control our impulses later on. Now that we have a good understanding of how self-control works, we can take the next step. We can apply our findings to the brain. We've been talking about how self-control relies on a limited energy resource. So when people expend self-control, they deplete themselves of their self-controlled energy. And what happens is when they try to control themselves later on, oftentimes they experience failure. So why does this happen? What's going on in the brain that's causing people to have so many problems controlling their impulses when they try to resist tempting foods or other sorts of tasks that sap their self-control energy? Well, recently, a group of researchers have asked this question, and they tested it within the context of two competing hypotheses. One hypothesis is that when people are depleted of their self-control energy, they simply have difficulty monitoring themselves, keeping track of what's going on, their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors, how their current actions are stacking up against what's the most desirable action. So that's one possibility. And the good thing about it is that there's a specific region of the brain that controls monitoring. It's called the anterior cingulate cortex. A second hypothesis that these researchers tested is that when people are depleted of their self-control energy, they simply have less of an ability to override impulses once they have them. So it's not as if being depleted of your self-control energy makes you unable to monitor what you're doing, or what you're feeling, or even what you're thinking. It simply depletes you of the strength, of the energy to override an urge once you have it. So to test this hypothesis, what the researchers did was they brought participants into a laboratory, and they had them sit down in a scanner using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to place these participants in situations that either would or would not deplete them of their self-control energy. And what they did was they constructed a version of watching television that would be depleting or not depleting. So how do they do this? Well, I think we've all watched the television where there are lots of things going on. Maybe there's the main program that we're watching, but then underneath that, there are also things that are going on. Maybe there are updates on scores. Maybe there are updates on news stories. We're all used to this. It doesn't take self-control to watch TV. But it does take self-control when I tell you, whatever you do not look at the words at the bottom of the screen. If you catch yourself looking down there, redirect your attention to the middle of the screen, to the main program. By telling you not to do something, you're going to be more likely to do it. And that's exactly what the researchers asked these participants to do. In the depleting condition, they set up a situation in the fMRI machine where they had to control their attention in that very way. In the non-depleting situation, participants were simply told to watch the screen like they would normally watch television. And after that, all participants were given an opportunity to control their impulses. So which of these two hypotheses received more support? The monitoring hypothesis or the strength hypothesis? Well, as these researchers predicted, when people were depleted of their self-control energy, they showed less activation in that brain region that's helpful in overriding impulses. There were no differences found in the monitoring region of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. So what these results tell us is that when people are depleted of their self-control, one reason why they have failures when they try to control their impulses later on is not because they can't monitor themselves. It's not because they don't know what they're doing. It's simply that they have limited strength, limited energy. And by having limited energy, people often succumb to the desires that they know aren't appropriate, but they simply don't have the strength to overcome. We've been talking about how self-control works, how it's extremely fragile. It depends on a limited energy resource that becomes depleted when we use it. And when we have depleted self-control energy, it can have disastrous consequences for our subsequent self-control attempts. We've been talking about these things as they function for most people in most situations, and there's some value to that. But I think we can all agree that we're not the same. We're unique. We have unique traits, characteristics, motivations, and experiences that we bring with us to different situations. And it's this uniqueness that might better help us explain why people fail to control their impulses in some situations and not in others. So researchers have begun to explore this in a couple of different ways. And today we're going to talk about two experiments that have explored these possibilities. Now, the first experiment looked at eating behavior. Now, eating is something that we all do and that many of us experience a lot of self-control failure with, whether it's that we're eating too much or we're eating the wrong things. We're constantly trying to override our impulses with regards to our eating behavior. But some people do this more than others. Some people are constantly watching what they eat and restraining their impulses to eat certain things so that they can eat other things. These people are what we call restrained eaters. Now, researchers have tested whether depleting situations are different for restrained eaters compared to other people. And so in one study, what these researchers did was they brought a bunch of people into the laboratory, some of whom were restrained eaters and others who weren't. And what they did was they put them in the presence of some extremely tempting food: Doritos, M&Ms, and Skittles. These are all things that aren't very good for us, but often tempt us in a lot of different ways. The idea was that simply being around these foods might be tempting, and it might require more self-control energy to override your impulse not to eat them for restrained eaters compared to unrestrained eaters. So how did they do this? Well, what they did was they sat participants down in a chair, and for half of them, they put the food right next to them in close physical proximity, and they left them there for a few minutes. The idea is that this would be extremely exhausting to do, especially for people who were restrained eaters. The other half of the participants had a much easier time of it. The tempting food was still in the room, but it was on the opposite end, out of sight, out of mind. Next, what the researchers did was they measured participants' self-control by seeing how much ice cream they would eat. And what they found was that when participants had been depleted of their self-control energy, they ate more ice cream. But this was especially true among chronic restrained eaters. When restrained eaters were put in the presence of some very tempting food, they had to exert even more self-control, and that led them to eat more ice cream later on. Now, eating isn't the only thing that we do to control our impulses, and where personality traits and experiences are important to take into account. Sexual behavior is another one of them. So, relationships often change the longer you've been in them. And one thing that changes is passion. Now, although some people are passionate for years and years and years, oftentimes the most passionate phase of your relationship is toward the beginning. During this phase of your relationship, you often have to exert self-control over your passionate feelings for your partner, your desire to be around your partner all the time, or even to engage in sexual behavior with your partner. So when you're depleted of your self-control energy and you're in the new stages of a relationship, you might be more likely to engage in sexual behavior. This is exactly what happens. Studies have shown that when people are depleted of their self-control energy, and when they're new in their relationship, that they engage in more sexual behavior. Whereas people who have been in their relationships for a long amount of time, who might not have to override their passionate feelings for their partner, when they're depleted of their self-control energy, it doesn't have much of an impact on their sexual behavior. So what these studies show us is not only the importance of understanding how self-control relies on a limited energy resource, but on the validity and the importance of taking into account people's unique characteristics, traits, and experiences that they bring with them to these situations. Because it's by understanding the complexity of how situations and personality traits interact that we can better understand why some people fail and why some people succeed when trying to control their impulses. Where does self-control energy come from? We understand how self-control works, and we also understand some of the neural mechanisms underlying self-control processes, but what we haven't looked at are some biological processes that are involved in self-control. Now, there are many things that are involved, and as my colleagues and I began to explore this very question, we ran some experiments. The first experiment was simply to see if we gave participants an opportunity to indulge themselves, if this would offset some of the negative effects that we were observing when people were depleted of their self-control energy. So in this experiment, participants were depleted of their self-control energy or not, and then what they were given an opportunity to do was indulge themselves by eating a tasty milkshake. Another group of participants were given a beverage to drink, but it was a gloppy mess. It had lots of calories in it, but it was mostly made out of half and half in water. And then there was a third group of participants who simply read magazines as a distraction task. After this, participants were given a self-control task that measured their persistence in the face of failure. Now, the results were surprising. Participants who did indulge themselves didn't suffer as much when they were depleted. But we found very similar results among participants who drank the gloppy mess. So we looked at the results and we were scratching our heads. And after a few minutes of discussing the results, we thought, well, maybe it's the calories. Maybe it's the energy that's offsetting these effects of self-control depletion. Now, about 10 years later, we have numerous studies that have confirmed this possibility. That by giving people a boost of metabolic energy, that it offsets the effects of depleted self-control energy. Whether it's coping with the prospect of your own mortality, delaying gratification, or engaging in other acts of self-control. By giving people a boost of metabolic energy, it tends to help their self-control. But how far can we extend this? If giving people a boost of metabolic energy helps them control their impulses, well, might there be a common biological process that we could observe in animals that don't even have a sense of self? That is, can we understand self-control processes in animals that have no sense of who they are? Now, to test this possibility, my colleagues and I looked at dogs. Now, dogs are great for a variety of different reasons, one of which is that they can control their impulses, another of which is that they have no idea who they are. They have no sense of identity. They don't know that they're dogs. And what we did was we set up a situation where we would either deplete dogs of their self-control energy or we did not deplete dogs of their self-control energy. Now, how do you do this? Well, what we did was we simply randomly assigned half of the dogs to sit and stay for 10 minutes. This takes a lot of work, a lot of mental energy. For the other half of the dogs, they were simply told to sit in a kennel for 10 minutes. Next, we gave the dogs a toy. and we put a bunch of food into the toy. And the dogs had learned that they could get food out of this. But on the day of the experiment, we rigged the toy so that they could not get the food out. And we timed how long they persisted in the face of failure. Now, consistent with what we find with humans, when dogs had been depleted of their self-control energy, they gave up a lot sooner. But our second study wanted to extend that in a crucial way. We depleted dogs, or we did not deplete dogs, of their self-control energy. And after that, for half of the dogs, we sprayed some glucose in their mouth. And the other half of the dogs, we sprayed a beverage that was sweet, but that contained no boost of metabolic energy. And as we'd expected, by giving the dogs a boost of metabolic energy, we offset the deficits associated with depleted self-control strength. So what these results show us is that there's a common biological process that can help us explain why people and even non-human animals fail to control their impulses. How can you recharge the self-control system? We've been talking a lot about how self-control does rely on a limited energy resource, but now let's talk about some practical activities that you can take with you and apply to your everyday life that uses what you've learned. These two activities are going to be biological and psychological. When we talk about a biological activity and biological processes that are involved in self-control, we're going to talk about metabolic energy first. The best thing that you can do in terms of starting your day is ensuring that you're giving yourself a boost of metabolic energy. The research literature has been looking at an effect that's called the breakfast effect, about whether it's important to have breakfast in the morning. And dozens of studies have shown that the most important thing about breakfast in the morning is simply whether you have it. So the first activity that I would simply like for you to do over the next week is to have breakfast every single day. Another component that's extremely important is sleep. So if depleted energy undermines our ability to control our impulses, the best way that we can recharge our self-control batteries is to have adequate sleep. To get 7 or 8 or even more hours of sleep is not a bad thing. In fact, it's going to help you achieve your goals. So over the next week, keep track of how much sleep you're getting and how tired you are at the end of the day. And what I'd encourage you to do is to increase the amount of sleep that you're getting if you're feeling tired. So we've talked about a biological activity that you can use to recharge the self-control system, but there are also psychological ways that we can do this. One way that you can do this is to simply think about your core values and beliefs. So every day for the next few days, simply write down what you think are fundamental values that you have in your life. Think about them, and then think about why they're so important to you, why they make you who you are, why they give your life a sense of purpose and meaning, how they help connect you with other people. Now, this affirmation exercise isn't just about making you happy, because studies have shown that it does do that. What's more important for our purposes is by affirming your beliefs and your values, it recharges the self-control energy system. It offsets the negative consequences of being deprived or depleted of your self-control energy. So the next time that you're feeling exhausted, pause and reflect on your most valued attributes, your core beliefs, and why they're important for you. By doing that, you're going to be more able to override your impulses and to exert better self-control. It sounds easy, but it works. are your self-control idols? We all have these people in our lives. People who motivate us, who inspire us, who encourage us to be better versions of ourselves. And we find them in all different walks of life. One area of our lives that we may look for inspiration comes to physical activity. And one self-control idol that lots of people have is Michael Phelps. He's an incredible athlete, having earned more Olympic medals than anyone in the history of the Games. But his self-control seems to be what's most impressive about him. In fact, in a recent interview, he said he couldn't remember the last day he didn't do a workout. Now, how many people can really say that? Another example of rock-solid self-control comes from ultramarathon man Dean Karnazes. Now, Dean Karnazes recently ran 50 marathons in 50 states in 50 days. Now, if you think that sounds incredible, think again. Dean also ran 350 miles consecutively without stopping. It took him 80 hours to do that, and toward the end of it, he said that he was sleeping while he was running. Now, Dean's most recent goal is to run a marathon in every single country in the world in a single year. That's over 200 marathons in a single year. That's pretty incredible. But outside of athletics, we can also gain insight and motivation and inspiration from people such as writers. As someone who loves to write, one of my self-control idols is Dame Barbara Cartland. Now, by all measures, she's one of the most prolific writers of all time. In fact, in a single year, she wrote 23 books. Stephen King is another example of tremendous self-control. Not only has he sold millions of copies of books, but he's written 2,000 words a day, every day, for decades. Haruki Murakami is another great example of a writer who has tremendous self-control. He goes to sleep every night at 9 p.m. and wakes up at 4 a.m. He begins his writing, and when he's done with it, he goes running. In fact, Murakami is not only a prolific writer, he's also an endurance athlete. But athletics and writing, those are just two areas of our lives where people exert self-control. Think of Oprah Winfrey. She overcame tremendous adversity in her life and went on to become not only one of the wealthiest people in the world, but one of the most influential women in the history of our planet. She's influenced numerous individuals in both the 20th and the 21st centuries. Nelson Mandela is another example of tremendous self-control, of persisting in the face of failure, of sticking to his beliefs even when it was difficult, and his self-control efforts paid off tremendously, ending apartheid in South Africa. Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., all of these people, if you line them up, they might look very different. They might have different skill sets, different experiences, maybe even different motivations. But one thing that they share in common is an inner strength, a strength that enables them to override any impulse to give up. Now, this inner strength is called self-control, and it's one of the most powerful inner strengths that we have. And fortunately, it's one of the most easiest to improve. So when you think of your self-control idols, what I want you to do is not only look at the fruits of their labor, but also think about what got them there. And what I would argue is that one facet that helped them achieve all of the success that they achieved in their lives is their ability to exert self-control successfully. When we're trying to understand self-control, what it is and why some people are so good at it, a lot of times we have to begin by understanding people who have extremely poor self-control. Now, this is similar to what other scientists do when they're trying to understand pathology. Physicians, when they're trying to understand how to treat someone, how to make them healthy, a lot of times they'll begin by trying to understand the person's disease or ailments that the people have. And by understanding those ailments or deficiencies, we can understand how to get these people better. Now, self-control is similar. And over the past several decades, researchers have begun to explore extreme cases, both within the scientific community and from real-world life, of when people, even high-achieving people, fail to control their impulses. Now, one of these examples comes from Spain. Now, during the Spanish Civil War, a man who is aged 21 was escaping from his apartment. And as he was making a mad dash out of his window, he fell. He slid down, and he was impaled on an iron bar. Now, he survived the fall amazingly, but the bar went through his brain. But it wasn't any old part of his brain, it was his frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe is an area of the brain that's responsible for self-control. So although this patient survived and went on to marry and have children, he also had lots of problems. He had difficulty managing his money. He lacked drive and purpose. He had difficulty planning things. He couldn't see long into the future. In fact, as he got older and older, his kids called him a protected person. So although other aspects of his life remained the same, when it came to controlling his impulses, there is a clear link between this damage to the frontal lobe of his brain and his ability to control his impulses later in life. Now, another famous example comes from Phineas Gage, who was working on the railroad, experienced an accident where a rod, again, went right through his brain. He survived the accident, but his life was never the same. He wasn't the same worker. He wasn't even the same relationship partner. But these are extreme examples, and they give us an understanding about how severe brain damage can undermine self-control, but there are a lot less extreme examples that can also help us see how people can fail to control their impulses. Oftentimes we look at political leaders who are often high-achieving people, but who also occasionally succumb to their impulses. Former President Bill Clinton is an example of this. Now, by all measures, he's an incredibly brilliant person, a Rhodes Scholar. But over the course of his life, he's also had some very public failings in his self-control. Now, more recently, General David Petraeus has also shown that he's human, that he has problems, and those problems can relate to his ability to control his impulses. Now, even this man, who lived his life as a model of self-discipline, showed that he too is prone to self-control failures in at least some areas of his life. But then there's the rest of us. All of us have problems controlling our impulses. We don't have to have serious injuries or occupy positions of authority to know that. Recent studies have estimated that about half the time that we try to control our impulses, we fail at it. And so what we're going to understand now is that we fail to control our impulses, and by having these problems, it's a beginning. It's a first step in trying to understand how self-control works so we can develop effective, scientifically based solutions to improve our self-control. Now, in the scientific literature, there are lots of different definitions of self-control floating around. In this course, we'll use a specific definition of self-control. And that definition is that self-control refers to overriding an impulse so that you can agree with a standard for what's appropriate. Now, when people have to control their impulses, usually three different things happen. The first thing that happens is that people feel an urge to do something, or to think about something, or to feel something. Next, what happens is people feel a desire or a motivation to override that urge, to override that impulse. And the third part of the self-control chain of events is by overriding that impulse, you've adhered to a standard, an objective reference point for what's appropriate. So let's see how this three-step process plays out in everyday life. What I'd like for you to do is to imagine a situation where you sit down at a table and you're presented with a very tempting food. A food that you like, but you also know that you shouldn't eat very often. Let's think of a donut. Now, most people like donuts, and they know that they shouldn't eat lots of them. What happens when people see donuts is they engage in self-control. So they experience a strong urge to eat 1, 2, or maybe even half a dozen donuts, and they override that urge. They go to battle with themselves a little bit. And by doing that, they remain in agreement. They adhere to a standard about the appropriate amount to eat in a given situation. So that's one example of the self-control chain of events playing out in our everyday lives. But then there are also areas of our life where we can apply the same sort of principles. Think about people who might have problems with gambling. When they're driving down the street and they see a casino, immediately they might get a strong urge to gamble. Next, this urge will be overridden. They'll go to battle with themselves. They'll tell themselves, whatever you do, do not drive into that parking lot. Don't go into the casino. Don't gamble. And the reason why they do that is so that they can remain in agreement with the standards set before themselves about what their goal is. What's the most desirable behavior in this circumstance? If I don't want to overeat, if I don't want to gamble, if I don't want to engage in other sorts of behaviors that I know are going to be damaging to my physical health, my mental health, my relationships, or other aspects of my life, I can override my impulse so that I can achieve those goals. And by doing that, I can live my life in a way that's more satisfying and fulfilling. So this is what self-control is, and this is just a snapshot of how it unfolds in everyday life. Now that we have a working definition of self-control, let's break it into its three main compartments. Now, the first part of self-control is called monitoring. And this simply refers to keeping track of what you think, what you feel, and how you're behaving. The more that people monitor themselves in these ways, oftentimes the better able they are to achieve their goals. One example of how monitoring plays out in people's lives is with their weight. Numerous studies have shown that the more that people monitor their weight, the healthier weight that they have. People who check their weight every day tend to have healthier weight levels than people who check their weight less frequently, maybe once a month, once every 3 months, or once a year. Our money is another area of our life where monitoring can play a vital role in helping us achieve our goals. It's never been easier to keep track of how much money you have coming in and how much money you have going out of your checking account and your saving account. Banks these days are making it extremely easy to do this, whether by logging on to a computer online or even by downloading an app on your phone. The good thing about this is that by keeping track of how much money you have, studies have shown that people are a lot more responsible with how they manage their money. So monitoring is the first compartment, the first part of what self-control is. The second part is what we refer to as standards. Standards are those reference points. They're personal, cultural, or societal standards that tell us what's appropriate in a given situation. Now, what are some examples of standards in our everyday life? Well, one of them is simply the laws that we have to obey as members of a particular society. Think of speed limits. A speed limit sign is a clear, objective indicator about a standard for what is appropriate in a given situation. Now, although many of us don't like to follow the speed limit, it at least shows us what a standard is and how important it is to follow it. Another example of standards is how we dress, what we wear. There are clear and sometimes even explicit directions about what you should wear and what you should not wear in certain circumstances. These are standards. When you make a decision about what to wear when you go to work, to a party, to a barbecue, or some other fun activity, what you're thinking about are standards. What's guiding me along the path of what's most appropriate in this circumstance? Now, monitoring and standards, those are the first two components of self-control, and the third is strength. This is simply the amount of energy that you have to control your impulses. Factors that can undermine your energy are mental exhaustion and stress. When people are fatigued, like at the end of the day, maybe after working 3 consecutive shifts, they might experience self-control failure. They might do things they normally wouldn't. And a reason for that is they simply have used up their limited supply of self-control energy. Now, the good thing about self-control energy is that you can build it up through practice. Just as you can strengthen your physical muscles through practice, you can strengthen your self-control muscles. In one of my favorite examples of this, Joshua 4, who is a science writer, set forth on an adventure that lasted 1 year. Now, in this adventure, what Joshua 4 set out to do was to win the USA Memory Championship. Now, how do you do this? Well, what Joshua 4 did was he spent an entire year practicing self-control in a very specific way regarding his memory performance. Now, although initially this was painful, it took a lot of energy to do this, what he found was that over time he built up his self-control strength. And at the end of a year, he won the USA Memory Championships. So self-control is important, and it's important for us to understand how it's divided into 3 main components: monitoring, standards, and strength. And although we have limited self-control strength, we can build it up and achieve our goals over time. If you could draw a picture of self-control, what would it look like? You might think of people exercising, eating healthy foods, working hard, paying attention. But if you ask me, I would draw a picture of a thermostat, because that's one way that self-control functions. Now think of how thermostats work. What do they do? What alerts them to when they get turned on? Well, one thing that we have to think about when we think of thermostats is that there's a clear standard for what's appropriate. There's a certain temperature that you want to have. And when things get hotter or colder, the thermostat kicks on and it adjusts things in the environment so that you can remain in adherence with that standard for the appropriate temperature. Now your body functions in a very similar way. You have a set core body temperature of 98.6 degrees. This is stable, and this alerts you to a very healthy level of a body temperature. But what happens when your temperature goes up or when it goes down? When you get a fever, or when you may even experience hypothermia? Well, as no surprise, you feel sick. You don't feel like yourself. And you do things to restore yourself to a sense of balance so that you return to the standard for what's appropriate. Now, self-control works in a very similar fashion. We're constantly seeking balance. And one way that we do that is we're steered or navigated toward what those standards are for what's appropriate. Now, this line of reasoning forms the backbone of what's called cybernetic theory. Now, cybernetic derives from the Greek word to steer or to navigate. And what we're talking about, what is going to help us have better self-control, it's these very standards that steer us and navigate us toward the appropriate thought, feeling, and behavior. Now, using this theory, we can walk ourselves through what it's like to exert self-control. Think of an example of a situation where there are clear-cut standards for how you should act, what you should think, or even what you should feel. Think of a funeral. Now you walk into the funeral and you begin to establish a baseline about what people are doing. This is the test phase. Next, what you do is you begin to do things. You're in the operate phase. Now, although you know what other people are doing, suddenly a thought comes into your head, a funny thought, and you begin to laugh uncontrollably. You look to your right and you look to your left and you see other people looking at you with very disapproving glances. This is the test phase again. You're receiving feedback from your environment that says you've gone off track. You're no longer engaging in appropriate action, and you need to correct that right away. The next phase is the exit phase. This is where people continue to test themselves. And it feeds back into this first phase where people test themselves again. They operate again. They test again, getting additional feedback. And they go through this process as long as is necessary in order for them to stop at this standard for what is deemed appropriate. So test, operate, test, exit. This forms the backbone of cybernetic theory. And this helps us explain why we constantly seek out balance in our life. Because by doing that, we're going to be doing what's appropriate. Now, people can do these sorts of things in different ways. They can pursue their goals using different strategies. One type of strategy is called a promotion focus. People who are promotion focused are extremely eager to achieve success. They're constantly entering their environments knowing that they can do well and trying to achieve all that they possibly can. Another strategy is slightly different. It's called a prevention-focused strategy. Instead of being extremely eager, prevention-focused people are vigilant. They're constantly looking for signs of where they might want to avoid making mistakes. So you can pursue self-control in lots of different ways using these two different strategies. But the important thing to remember is how we're naturally programmed to want to have balance. Because by having balance, we're going to be able to get along with other people a lot easier because we'll be doing what's appropriate. Now that we understand what self-control is and a little bit about how it works, let's talk about a practical way that we can improve our self-control in a way that's not going to take a whole lot of work. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, one way that we can improve our self-control is by forming what are called implementation intentions. What an implementation intention does is it essentially takes your mind out of the middle of the equation between your desire and what you actually do. Where do we get tripped up when we're trying to control our impulses? We all know what we want to do in most situations, yet we often have problems meeting our goals. One reason for this is we go to battle with ourselves. We fight with ourselves. We debate with ourselves about if this is the appropriate thing to do and why. By forming an implementation intention, it gets rid of that mental argument. And research has shown over dozens and dozens of studies that this is a safe and effective way of improving people's self-control, of helping them to achieve their goals. So how do you form one of these? How do you form an implementation intention? All that you do is you form an if-then agreement. Think of it as a mental contract you're setting up for yourself. Now let's apply this to physical activity. Let's say that you have a goal of becoming more active in your life. If you want to improve your physical activity, one thing that you can do is set up an implementation intention that says, if I get home from work, then I'll get my exercise clothes and exercise for 10 minutes. What you've done is you've set a clear and specific plan for how you're going to achieve your goal. So now, when you get home and you have this lingering idea as to whether or not you should work out, the mental work has already been done for you, by you. You've already set up a contract that you've agreed to that says, I'm home now, the first part of this agreement is done. Now I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to get my clothes and I'm supposed to work out for just 10 minutes. Now let's think of this in the choices that we make with our money. A lot of times when people are spending money that they might not have, or when people are failing to control their impulses when it comes to their money, they're doing so when they're mentally fatigued or under duress. They're depleted of their self-control energy. So if you're having problems in your life that are related to this, simply set up an implementation intention for yourself. And that implementation intention could be as simple as, if I want to charge something on my credit card after 10 p.m., then I'll wait to buy that thing until the next morning. So what this does is it frees you up. You're not doing battle against yourself as to whether or not, do I really need this? Do I not need this? You're not going to buy it tonight because you've already decided for yourself that that's not the best thing for you to do right now. Now, it sounds almost too good to be true that simply by setting up these if-then contingency statements in your life, that it's going to help you achieve your goals. But there's a lot of scientific evidence that backs this up, whether it's related to your work, to your physical health, to other types of self-control or goal-related problems that you're facing. By setting up these implementation intentions, you're getting your mind out of the middle. And in this case, that's a good thing in terms of enabling you to achieve your goals. And so by understanding what self-control is and how it works, we can better achieve our goals. And we have a clear-cut strategy for effective tools we can bring into our lives that can help us struggle less, to live a little bit easier, and to achieve things that we didn't think were even possible. What is the ideal trait? This is a difficult question. Think of the trait that you would like to have personally, above all others. What's a trait that you would like to have if you're looking for a relationship partner? Whether it's a friend, a romantic partner, or even someone in the workplace. Now, one answer to this question lies in the problems that people report having most frequently. When people talk about the problems that they have, the problems usually fall on 3 different levels of analysis. The first level is problems they're having personally, in terms of their physical health or even their mental health. At another level, people report having problems in their relationships. They might have stormy relationships at work. They can't get along with their coworkers. Maybe their kids are misbehaving. Or maybe they're having a difficult time getting along with their romantic partner. At a third level of analysis, we have to look at problems that people are having in terms of functioning as members of society. Sometimes people have difficulty getting along with others and obeying the laws that are set forth by society. So if we're thinking of an ideal trait, a trait that you would want to have, or that you would want other people in your life to have, let's think of a trait that's associated with the lowest level of problems on all 3 of those levels. And what we'll find is that the ability to delay gratification is one of the best traits that you can have. Now, studies of delay of gratification have been going on for decades. In one of the most famous studies, preschool students at Bing Nursery School, which was affiliated with Stanford University, completed a very, very simple study. This is how it went. So they were given a number of different options. They sat down and an adult talked to them. These kids were all 4 or 5 years old. And the adult said, you can have 1 marshmallow now, or you can wait and get 2 marshmallows if you can wait for 15 minutes. I'm going to leave the room and I'm going to leave you alone with this marshmallow. Now, unbeknownst to the kids, the experimenter left a camera in that room and they recorded what the kids were doing. Now, the videotapes of what these kids were doing to help them delay gratification are hilarious, but they often show us how difficult it can be to delay gratification, especially when we're very young. Now, the strategies that some of the kids used were very imaginative. Some of the kids did peekaboo with the marshmallows. Other kids petted the marshmallows like they were animals to distract themselves from the fact that this was a food that they were trying not to eat. So what happened next was a big surprise. Years later, Walter Mischel, who was one of the researchers in charge of the study, began to hear stories about what was happening to these kids. And what he found was that the kids who had a better ability to delay gratification when they were very young, they tended to have better success later in life. And the nice thing is that the success that these kids were having, they were having at those 3 different levels of analysis where people report most problems. Kids who were better able to delay gratification at ages 4 and 5, they tend to have better mental health later in life. And they tend to have better physical health. If we look at the relationships that these kids had, they also tended to have healthier relationships. One way that they measured this is that kids who had a better ability to delay gratification early in life, when they followed up with them years later, they were less likely to have divorced. And at a societal level, these kids turned out to be better members of society. And one way that you could assess that is that these kids were substantially less likely to be aggressive kids. So these findings give us some insight into one important trait that we can have: the ability to delay gratification. Is self-control a uniquely human trait, or do other animals have the capacity to control their impulses? Now, this is a very simple question, but it has tremendous payoffs. And the main payoff is to see whether we evolved to have self-control. If we can see signs of self-control in lower order animals, it can give us some understanding as to whether or not this helped early humans in terms of enabling them to survive and to reproduce. Now, researchers have been asking themselves this question for several years, and they've been asking it with lots of different types of animals. The first type of animal that I'm going to talk about is one that we've seen at lots of zoos, maybe on the television. But when you look at these animals, oftentimes you might not think that they are prime examples of self-control. These animals are monkeys. Do monkeys have the capacity to regulate themselves, to delay gratification? Well, a group of researchers asked this very question. And what they did was they sat a bunch of capuchin monkeys down in front of some food. And the food was on a revolving table. Some of the food was extremely rewarding, and other food was pleasurable, but it wasn't as rewarding. And what the researchers wanted to see is if these monkeys could delay gratification, so that when they saw a mildly tempting and mildly rewarding food, if they could delay eating that food so that they could get a larger, more promising food later on. Now, as the researchers hypothesized, the monkeys were able to delay gratification. So this gives us some initial evidence that humans are not alone on the planet in terms of our ability to regulate ourselves, to delay gratification. But this isn't the only animal that researchers have looked at when it comes to self-control. Let's look at another animal that's extremely similar to us humans in terms of their genetic relatedness to us. And for this, we're going to look at chimpanzees. So what these researchers did was they got a bunch of chimpanzees and they taught them some things. Specifically, they taught them the value of various tokens. Some of the tokens had low value, other tokens had medium value, and then a third group of tokens had very, very high levels of value. Next, what the researchers did was they presented these chimpanzees with an opportunity to delay gratification so that they could take a small reward or they could delay gratification so that they could have one of the tokens worth a big reward later on. Were these chimpanzees able to do it? They were. Again, we show more signs that humans are not alone. Chimpanzees were able to delay gratification much in the same way that humans are able to delay gratification. But let's look at an animal that we might think is so dissimilar to us humans that they have no capacity to delay gratification. Let's look at rats. Now, people have a lot of different opinions about rats. One opinion is that they're very, very dissimilar to humans. But in reality, they show some similarities. And when we look at their ability to delay gratification, we find another similarity. Rats are able to delay gratification, much in the same way that humans are able to. But the similarities don't stop there. Just as you find differences across the lifespan in the ability to delay gratification in humans, you find very similar age-related differences in rats. So just as young humans often have more difficult times regulating their impulses compared to older humans, rats look very similar. The very young rats tend to have problems delaying gratification a lot more than the older rats. So all of this evidence points to a very clear conclusion that humans are not unique in their ability to delay gratification. And what this tells us is that we may have evolved to have this trait because it helps not only humans, but it helps non-human animals in terms of surviving and reproducing. How can we understand delay of gratification using the principles of neuroscience? Now, these kids in the initial delay of gratification studies that were conducted over 40 years ago, they're adults now. They've gone through lots of things in their life. But one thing that researchers have begun to do is they've begun to call them up and to ask these kids who are now adults to come into the laboratory so that they can see how their brains work. Now, the idea here is that by understanding how kids who are now adults, how their brains respond to different sorts of stimuli, how that might help us understand why delay of gratification helped predict outcomes like personal success, mental health, physical health, relationship health, and even things like aggression. So let's start by focusing on the adults who, as children, were very able to delay gratification. What they did was they took these kids and they put them in an fMRI machine. And what they did was they exposed them to a situation where they had to exert self-control. During this entire period, they recorded blood flow in the brain. Now, what the researchers found was riveting. What they found was that these adults who were better able to delay gratification, when they were presented with situations that required self-control, they had increased activation in brain regions that help people override their impulses. So it's as if these adults who are better able to delay gratification, their brains just seem to function a little bit better when it comes to helping them override their urges. But that's only half of the story. Instead of focusing all of their efforts on the adults who were high delay of gratification, they switched gears and looked at the adults who, as children, had difficulty delaying gratification. These were the kids who, instead of waiting the entire 15 minutes until the experimenter came back, some of them gobbled up that marshmallow. What do these kids look like as adults in terms of their brain activity? To answer this question, the researchers scanned these adults in an fMRI machine. And what they showed is that these adults had an overactive reward center in their brain. when they were given situations where they had to override their impulses, these adults showed increased activation in reward centers of the brain. So when you think of it, when these adults are presented with different situations that might cause them to have a desire to do something, that desire is much stronger than the desire that the other kids had. And this might help explain why these people who have a low ability to delay gratification, why they had some problems later on in life. When they were confronted with situations that were tempting, that temptation, that desire was stronger for them. Now, other research has shown very similar responses. In another study with an independent sample of participants, what the researchers did was they looked at the adults' ability to delay gratification. This time, because they were adults, they used money instead of marshmallows. And what they found was that the adults who had a better ability to delay gratification when it came to money, that their brains were actually structured differently. So that's important. It's not just how the brain functions, but it's how the brain is actually structured. So a greater ability to delay gratification in these adults was associated with having less white matter in the frontal lobes. And remember, the frontal lobes, that's where a lot of self-control goes on. So what we've learned is that neuroscience can tell us a lot about the ability to delay gratification. How people who are better able to delay gratification tend to have an overactive brain when it comes to overriding their impulses. And how people who have problems delaying gratification have an overactive reward system. And we've also seen how people who have problems delaying gratification, how their brains might even be structured a little bit differently in terms of white matter in the prefrontal cortex. Now, we've been talking about a very narrow component of self-control, delay of gratification. And we've seen how it's a very powerful predictor of success later in life in a variety of different domains. But what if we take a step back and instead of focusing on a very narrow behavioral measure of self-control, what if we think of self-control in very general terms? In terms of whether people are generally able to control their impulses or not. Will that pay off in the same way that delay of gratification does? Will having high levels of general self-control help people have better mental health, physical health, relationships, or even be better members of society? Well, researchers have asked this question in much the same way that the early delay of gratification studies did. So, in one of the most comprehensive studies to date to answer this question, the researchers followed a group of kids, over 1,000 children, from the time that they were born until the present day. When the kids were about 10 years old, they got a measure of their self-control in general. And they got it from a variety of different sources. They asked the kids, but they also asked the kids' parents and the kids' teachers from school. And what the researchers did was they combined responses from all of these different sources to give each child a single score of general self-control. Next, what the researchers did was they waited very patiently for over 20 years, and they followed up with these kids who are now in their 30s. And they wanted to see if having good self-control at age about 10, if it would pay off when these kids were in their 30s. And as the researchers predicted, having better self-control was associated with all sorts of different positive outcomes. These kids had better physical health. They also had more wealth. They made more money to the extent that they had better self-control early on in life. But in one of the most stunning results from this study, they also asked these adults if they had ever been convicted of a crime. Now remember, criminal behavior is a good marker of societal well-being. People who commit crimes are often even removed from society. They threaten society. And what they found was that the more self-control that these people had at age 10, the less likely they were to have been convicted of a crime by the time they were in their 30s. So this gives us some initial evidence that general self-control is important. But let's think of one of the most important outcomes that we can measure. It's more important than your mental health, maybe your current physical health, how much money you have in your bank account, or maybe even if you've been convicted of a crime. Mortality. Now this is something we're all going to experience, but there are things that we can do to extend our lives. So in one of the most famous longitudinal studies ever conducted, the Taming study, what they did was they followed people over decades, and they wanted to see what were some of the best predictors about predicting a person's mortality. And what they found is that one of the most important predictors in this study of having a long and healthy life was whether or not people had high levels of self-control. Now, one question that people often ask me when it comes to self-control is if we're just talking about intelligence. Well, intelligence and self-control are related to each other, but they're not the same thing. And in fact, one thing that we can do is we can see which of these two factors is more important in predicting certain kinds of success. So one study that did this got a group of adolescents, and they measured their self-control in general, and they also got measures of their IQ. Next, what the researchers did, again, was they waited patiently. And they followed up with these adolescents at the end of the school year and got a measure of their grade point average. And what they did was they compared whether self-control or IQ was a more important predictor, a stronger predictor, of how well these kids did in school. And what they found was shocking. Self-control was over twice as important in predicting end-of-year grade point averages compared to intelligence. Now put that another way, and self-control outdid IQ 2-to-1 in predicting how well these adolescents did in school. So although these results don't suggest that intelligence is unimportant, what they do show us is the importance of self-control in general in predicting various indicators of success, whether we're talking about physical health, how much wealth people have, if they're good contributing members of society, and also if they're having success in the classroom. We've learned quite a bit about delay of gratification and how it's associated with indicators of success later in life. But now what we should do is try to use that information and apply it to our own lives. What I'd like for you to do is an activity that I call Delay Your Day. Now to do this, we're going to identify 3 different domains of your life: your work life, your family life, and then a third domain that you identify. Maybe it's a domain related to your health, such as exercise goals or your eating goals. So think of these 3 domains of your life: your work life, your family life, and maybe your health. Now what I'd like for you to do is think of some times in each of these domains when you have to delay gratification, where you have an impulse to do something, but you have to override your impulse so that you can achieve your goal within that domain. Now that you have a list at your disposal, what I'd like for you to do is to approach each of those times, in those domains where you have to exert delay of gratification, and do that for 5 minutes each day. Now, 5 minutes doesn't seem like a lot, but remember, self-control is fragile. It depends on a limited energy resource. So we don't want to make you mentally worn out, mentally fatigued. So when you get to the end of this activity, what I hope that you'll see is that things have changed. Whereas it was very difficult initially to delay gratification, whether it was at work or in family or in your health, now it's becoming easier because you've built up your self-control muscle. The next step is to increase the time that you're delaying gratification. Instead of 5 minutes, work your way up a little bit. Go to 7 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or a half an hour. What you'll notice is that it'll become easier and easier over time. The more that you practice self-control, the better you get at it. And finally, now that you've focused on these 3 domains in your life, look at other domains in your life where you might need some help. We all have self-control struggles. But now what we can do is we can use this very exercise to make us stronger in the face of adversity, so that we can persist in the face of failure. By delaying your day, you're going to have adequate strength to overcome these obstacles and to achieve your goals. Let's think of another practical activity that you can take with you to improve your self-control in your daily life. Now, in this activity, what you're going to learn how to become is a better mental energy accountant. You keep track of a lot of what you do on a daily basis. But what I would argue and what I would predict is that you rarely keep track of how each activity uses your limited supply of self-control energy. So what I'd like for you to do over the next week is every day when you are preparing your day, list the activities that you're going to do. And then next to them, list how much self-control you're going to need to do those activities. One thing that you'll notice is how a lot of your activities require very little self-control. And that's a good thing. As humans, we're naturally inclined to seek out routines, to explore things that will limit our ability and our necessity to use our limited self-control energy. But then there are going to be things that are going to require your attention and your energy. And what you want to do is you want to plan ahead so that you're not caught off guard. Studies have shown that when people anticipate activities that are going to require self-control, they conserve their mental energy very judiciously. And by conserving their mental energy, it helps them perform later on. They're better able to meet their goals. And so what I'd like for you to do is to engage in this activity over a week. List your activities every single day and how much energy each of those activities is going to take. Check in with yourself at the middle of the day and check in with yourself at the end of the day. What I expect that you'll find is that you were better able to conserve your mental energy and to achieve your goals. So this is just another example of the importance of self-control, but also how easy it is to improve. By becoming a better mental energy accountant, you'll get to the end of your day less fatigued, less worn out, but also with a greater sense of accomplishment, because you will have been better able to achieve your goals. When was the last time that you were frustrated or even angry? The potential for anger pervades modern social life. Whether it's getting cut off in traffic, maybe your coworkers are giving you grief about something, or maybe even in your family. People are frustrating you, or they're making you angry. Now, we all get angry, but now think back to that last time that you experienced anger, and I want to ask, did you lash out at the other person with physical aggression? Now, my guess is that you didn't do that. But why not? What came between you experiencing this aggressive urge and this outcome of not behaving aggressively? What got in the middle? Well, I would argue that self-control is one thing that got in the middle. Now, although we get angry on a regular basis, we often live in a time that's the most peaceful that we've ever known in the history of the planet. Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, talks about this. Now, when we understand why that is, well, we can think of two components of self-control that helps make that possible. The first of which is monitoring. Now remember, monitoring, keeping track of your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, that's a core feature of self-control. And the more that you're doing it, the better off you are. Now, how has our ability to monitor aggression and violence changed over the past couple hundred years? Well, it's gotten a lot easier to do it. Think of J. Edgar Hoover. Now, he was famous for a lot of different reasons, but one thing that he did was he made it a lot easier to monitor people in terms of their criminal history. He was very much a proponent of having a fingerprint registry to identify people who had violent and criminal backgrounds. But J. Edgar Hoover isn't where the change stopped. If you look at the internet, it's made it a lot easier to keep track of people who have committed crimes. You can even look up whether your neighbor has a criminal history. So monitoring is one thing that's helped us keep track of people who commit violent crimes. But another thing that's changed that can also help us explain why we live in such a peaceful society is that standards related to violence and aggression have also changed. Now remember, a standard is simply a reference point, a point on which most people can agree that certain things are desirable or appropriate and other things aren't. Think of how this relates to aggression. How have attitudes and beliefs about the appropriateness of aggression changed over the past couple hundred years? They've changed dramatically. When you're reading the newspaper and you're looking at the obituaries, how often do you really see that someone was killed in a duel? Very, very infrequently. Yet the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, that's how he died. Now we have a lot more effective ways of resolving conflict. And one reason for that is that as cultures progress, we develop standards and ways that we can change our attitudes toward the appropriateness of violence. Because we don't have to use violence to solve our conflicts, we can use other, more effective ways. Another way of understanding how standards have shifted is simply looking at corporal punishment and how that has become less and less common in the United States public school system. So currently, 31 states in the United States forbid the use of corporal punishment in the public school setting. But what's most interesting is, when did that occur? There was a clear shift in the standard as to when it became inappropriate to use corporal punishment in public schools. Because of the 31 states that currently forbid corporal punishment in public schools, 30 of them began to forbid corporal punishment after 1970. So what we've seen are a couple different reasons why aggression has become less and less common. And these reasons, again, relate to self-control. By making it easier to monitor violence and aggression, we become a less violent culture. And by shifting our standards, these things that we use that guide and steer our behavior, by talking about and thinking about aggression as something that we should not engage in to solve our problems, what we've seen are decreases in aggression over time. So again, what this shows us is the importance of self-control in everyday life, and how it can help us explain why people, even though they get angry on a regular basis, oftentimes refuse to act on those aggressive impulses and instead use self-control. Now, although we live in one of the most peaceful times in the history of the world, aggression still occurs. And we have to ask ourselves, why does that happen? Although monitoring has become easier and standards related to aggression have changed, one thing that hasn't changed is our strength, the amount of energy that it takes to override an aggressive impulse. Now, a couple of criminologists sought to understand what are some of the best predictors of criminal behavior. And what they did was they combed over hundreds of studies to formulate what they called a general theory of crime. Now, all of their efforts paid off handsomely. And at the end of the day, they identified two of what they called the best predictors of criminal behavior. The first is simply opportunity. When people have more opportunities to engage in criminal behavior, they take advantage of those opportunities. But the second factor is of particular interest to us: self-control. And they looked at all sorts of signs related to lapses in self-control as helping to understand why people engage in criminal behavior. Now, one of these examples comes from burglaries. Now, we all have a stereotype in our head of what burglaries kind of look like. We might see a white van that's been stolen, and there are burglars in the van, and they're all wearing black, and they might have ski masks on. And through a careful series of plans, they burglarize a house or an institution. Now, the reality is quite different. Most burglaries are committed within a mile of the perpetrator's home. So instead of heisting stolen goods using a stolen van, most people walk to the places that they rob. So it's an act of impulsivity instead of careful planning. Violent crime is another example of impulsivity at work. One way that you can look at this is think of factors that make people more impulsive, that make people unable to control their impulses, and how that might play into their propensity to engage in violent behavior. Think of alcohol intoxication, for example. Now, one report from the U.S. Department of Justice argued that 40% of violent crimes are committed when people are under the influence, when people are intoxicated. Again, what this shows is that when people are in a state where they can't control their impulses very well, such as when they're intoxicated, they're a lot more likely to engage in violent behavior. Another way to look at this is when violent crimes are committed. So are most violent crimes committed early in the day, when people are full of energy and can regulate themselves, or toward the end of the day, when people are fatigued and worn out? Well, what the data suggests is that the majority of violent crimes are committed between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Again, this is a time when people are often fatigued, when they're unable to control their impulses. Again, showing us a link, although it's a correlation, but a reliable link between lapses in self-control and violent crime. But what happens when you put these two things together? Let's think of bars. And bars are places where people have lots of fun, but they're oftentimes where people get alcohol to drink, where people become intoxicated. And we know that when people are intoxicated, they're a lot more likely to engage in violent behavior. But we can correlate that as well with how long the bars actually stay open. And one recent study has shown that the longer that bars stay open, the more violent crimes are committed. Now, although this is simply a correlation, an association between two different variables, what it suggests is that not only by becoming intoxicated are you more likely to engage in violent crime, but by being intoxicated at a time of day when you're mentally fatigued, it can prove extremely costly. Now, the researchers in charge of this wanted to quantify the financial costs associated with this spike in violent crime when bars stay open late at night. And what they showed was that bars in New York that stayed open after 1 a.m., it was associated with an increase of costs associated with violence of $194 million. Now, that's not a trivial cost. And it also doesn't take into account all of the other negative consequences that accompany violence. When people feel frustrated or angry, do they need self-control energy in order to override their urge to behave aggressively? Can this help us explain why some people have problems controlling their aggressive impulses, and why some people even succumb to those impulses and engage in actual aggressive behavior? To explore this possibility, a group of researchers conducted a simple experiment. What they did was they invited some college students into a laboratory, and they had them sit down at a table, and they told them that this experiment investigated taste testing. The first thing that they were going to do was compose an essay that was about a topic that was important to them. The experimenter collected the essay, left, came back, and this time the experimenter had a plate of food that the experimenter sat in front of the participant. Now, for half of the participants, they sat in front of a food that was extremely delicious. It was a donut. The experimenter said, "What I'd like for you to do is eat the donut and tell us what you think about it, how sweet it is, and other sorts of things that'll tell us what this donut tastes like." Next, the experimenter waited for the participant to begin to eat the donut. And as soon as the participant lifted the donut up to take a bite, the experimenter said, "Wait, do not eat the donut. I made a mistake, I'm sorry. Put the donut down. I'm going to leave and I'm going to fix this so that we can go and get on with the rest of this study. But whatever you do, don't eat the donut." Now, the idea is that by sitting in front of this donut that you're not supposed to eat, it takes a lot of self-control not to eat it. Now, it was so difficult, in fact, that for a couple of these participants, they ate it anyway. Now, the other half of the participants, they sat in front of a piece of food that was less tempting. They sat in front of a radish. So the idea is that for some of these participants, they had to exert a lot of self-control not to eat this food that was in front of them, whereas other participants had to exert very little self-control not to eat the food that was in front of them. Next, what the experimenter did was the experimenter came back and gave them some feedback about their essay that was ostensibly from another person. Now, in reality, this other person worked for the experimenter. It was a Confederate. And the feedback was extremely negative. The reason the feedback was negative is the experimenters wanted to evoke a sense of frustration in participants, and it was effective. But the next thing that the experimenters did was they gave participants an opportunity to lash out at this person who had just frustrated them. Now, how did they do this? Well, in this study, what they did was they gave participants a plate full of chips and a bottle of hot sauce. And they told them that they could dump as much of this hot sauce on the chips as they wanted to. And this plate of food was going to go to the person who had just frustrated them. But the key is that this partner that they had, who had just insulted them, hated spicy foods. So the more hot sauce that participants put onto these chips, the more aggressively they were behaving. What they found is that participants who had been depleted of their mental energy, who had exerted a lot of mental effort to not eat that tempting donut, they behaved a lot more aggressively when they were provoked. Now, a follow-up study replicated those results of when people are depleted of their self-control energy, that they're more likely to lash out at others. But what this follow-up study also did was it took into account people's levels of self-control that they brought with them into the laboratory. Their general dispositions and abilities to control their impulses. And what the researchers found is that by understanding the traits that people bring with them to situations, people's general ability to control their impulses, it helped them predict who is most likely to behave aggressively. So it wasn't just being depleted of mental energy that increased aggression, but it was also when people are depleted of their mental energy and they have a low ability to control their impulses, those are the people who are most likely to lash out at others. So what these findings again show us is the complexity of self-control and how it helps us understand who is most likely to behave aggressively and under what circumstances. It's important to understand that self-control is limited, and when people have limited energy to control their impulses, they're often going to behave more aggressively. But this relationship is especially pronounced among people who naturally have an inability to control their impulses. So by understanding how these two factors interact with each other, we can better understand why aggression occurs and who is most at risk for behaving aggressively. We've been talking about how self-control can help us explain criminal behavior and aggression between strangers. But can self-control help us understand aggression between people who love each other, romantic partners, intimate partner violence? Now, intimate partner violence occurs at alarmingly high rates. Among college students, there are estimates that as many as 34% of college students report at least one act of physical aggression in their relationship over the past year. Now, if we go outside of the college population, among adults in the United States who are in long-term romantic relationships, the rates aren't as high, but they're still about 20%. So can self-control help us understand who is most at risk for behaving aggressively? Well, researchers have begun to explore this question. And one way that they've been doing this is with controlled laboratory experiments. Now, in one laboratory experiment, they brought couples into the research lab. And they had them do tasks that either depleted them of their self-control energy or did not deplete them. Specifically, they had participants watch a video program where they either had to control their attention or they didn't have to control their attention. Next, participants were provided with some feedback from their romantic partner. Now, in reality, the feedback was prepared ahead of time by the experimenters. The feedback was either extremely positive or extremely negative. And the idea was that the experimenters wanted to make participants happy with their partner or kind of frustrated with their partner. Next, the experimenters gave participants an opportunity to make their partner engage in some physically painful activities. Specifically, they gave them a list of yoga positions that they could decide for their partner to do, and how long they had to hold each one. Now, the experimenter told participants that these yoga positions, they won't cause any permanent physical damage, but they're extremely painful. So the prediction is that when participants were depleted of their self-control energy, and they had been frustrated by their romantic partner, that they would make their partner hold the yoga positions longer than anyone else in the study. And that's exactly what the researchers found. When people were depleted of their self-control energy, and their partner had frustrated them, they made their partner hold those yoga positions a lot longer than anyone else in the actual experiment. But what this study left out was an important factor. So we know that depleted self-control energy mixed with frustration will increase aggressiveness, even in romantic relationships. But what we don't know is whether this effect is most pronounced among people who are naturally aggressive people. So to explore this possibility, a group of researchers brought in a couple of samples of dating participants. And what they had them do was complete a measure of self-control, and at the end of the day, they reported on how much their partner had provoked them. They also completed a measure that assessed how naturally physically aggressive they were. Another thing that the experimenters did at the end of the day was they showed participants a doll that represented their partner. And what they told participants is that this doll represents your partner, and because we've been asking you lots of questions about your partner and maybe some negative behaviors, we want to give you an opportunity to let some of that negative energy out. And so what you can do is you can insert some pins into this doll that represents your partner, from 0 to 51 pins. And this was used as a measure of aggressive inclinations. So as predicted, when people had low levels of self-control and they were highly provoked by their partner, they put the most pins into the doll. But this was most pronounced among people who are naturally aggressive. These three factors created a perfect storm in helping us to identify who is most at risk for behaving aggressively. And this study was replicated among a sample of newlywed couples. And instead of using the doll measure of aggressive inclinations, they found the same results with actual physical aggression in the relationship. So what these results tell us is that self-control can help us explain not only criminal behavior and aggression between strangers, it can help us explain who is most at risk for behaving aggressively in their romantic relationships and why. What can neuroscience tell us about the relationship between self-control and aggression? Well, there are a couple different ways of getting at this question. One way that we can do this is we can identify people who are at highest risk for behaving aggressively, and we can look at how their brains function. Researchers have begun to do this, and they've identified the most violent people on the planet, people who are psychopaths. And what they've done is they've explored how the psychopathic brain might differ from people who are not psychopathic. What they've shown consistently are some differences. And these differences are related to self-control. One reliable difference in the psychopathic brain is that they have less volume in the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and this is the seat of self-control. Now, although they have reduced volume in the prefrontal cortex, psychopaths have more volume in the reward center of the brain, also known as the striatum. So you can think of the psychopathic brain as a brain that functions a little bit differently than the rest of our brains. There's less activation going on in the prefrontal cortex, which is the brain region that helps us override impulses. And when we think of what those impulses feel like, the psychopathic brain, they experience stronger reward responses. So this is one way that you can understand the relationship between self-control and aggression using neuroscience. Another way is to look at how healthy, normal folks respond in aggressive situations using functional magnetic resonance imaging. And so one study did this very thing. They brought a group of participants into a laboratory and sat them down in an fMRI scanner. Next, what they did was they frustrated participants while they were having their brains scanned. The way that they did this is the person who was talking to them through the microphone intercom system started insulting them a little bit, making them angry. What they found is that when people were insulted, blood began to flow to a region of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. This is a region of the brain that tells you that something is going completely wrong in your environment and you have to do something to correct it. Next, what participants were given was an opportunity to ruminate. And what they showed was that when people were ruminating, they were using a region of the brain that's involved in active regulation, the prefrontal cortex. So now we can begin to see why people lash out at others after they've engaged in rumination. Rumination wears people out because blood is flowing to the prefrontal cortex. So I think we've begun to see how neuroscience can help us explain who is most at risk for behaving aggressively and why. We've learned that there's a clear relationship between self-control and aggression. People who have poor self-control are often extremely aggressive people. And factors that might undermine our ability to control our impulses can increase our chances of lashing out at others. What are some activities that we can use to reduce our aggressive inclinations? One thing that we can do is to build our self-control strength. Now, because self-control relies on a common energy resource, when we practice self-control in one domain, it helps us in other, even unrelated domains. So for this activity, what I would like for you to do is for 1 week between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., use your non-dominant hand for everyday activities. Whether it's cooking your food, brushing your teeth, or using your telephone, it's going to take self-control to complete this activity. It might even be frustrating or exhausting early on. That's why you're going to do it over an extended period of time. By practicing self-control, what you're going to find is that when you're confronted with situations where you become angry and frustrated, you're going to have added self-control muscle to overcome your impulses. And scientific studies have shown that this activity actually reduces people's aggressive inclinations when they're mentally fatigued. A second activity is far simpler. We know that having adequate metabolic energy is helpful in helping people have good self-control. We also know that people who struggle with metabolic energy, who feel like they have low blood sugar, they're often more likely to lash out at other people. And so what I'd like for you to do is to strategically keep food around. but not any food. What I want you to do is target foods that are going to give you a boost of metabolic energy. Now, although this might be straight up sugar, what I would argue is that a much more effective use of your energy can be gotten through proteins. Things that are going to break down into energy a lot slower. And by doing this, you're going to be a lot less likely to lash out at other people. And these two activities will help you gain skills and strength so that you might not engage in behaviors that you might regret later. What does it take to make a positive and lasting first impression? Now, I think we all have a general idea about how we do this. One thing is we try not to fidget that much. We try not to move our body so much that we might make other people uncomfortable. Another thing we might want to do is show interest in another person, to get them talking about themselves, to listen more than we speak. By doing this, we'll show other people that we're not selfish, that we actually care about them, and this will make a positive, lasting impression. Another thing that we can do is we can be careful about the types of information we share with other people. So we don't want to become aloof or standoffish, but we don't want to divulge too personal of details about ourselves to scare people away. So in effect, what we do when we're making a first impression is we're engaging in a lot of self-control, even though we don't realize it. It takes a lot of energy to have first meeting encounters. But what people often don't realize is the effect that they're having on others. Can we wear other people out? And how can we do that? And how can we avoid that? Well, one thing that we can do is we can understand some basic properties of interactions. What happens even when we don't think about it? One basic property of interactions is that we tend to mimic each other or mirror each other. Whether it's what we're saying or even how we're saying it, or how our bodies are moving. We're naturally inclined to mirror other people. Now, there's some controversy about why this happens, but very reliably, studies have shown that people do this, and animals do it too. We mimic each other, we mirror each other, and this might help us form strong social bonds with other people. So what happens when you refuse to mimic with another person? How will that influence the other person's behavior? Will it make them like you more? Will it wear them out? Will it exhaust them because they're trying to make sense of what's happening? To answer this question, a group of researchers brought a bunch of students into a laboratory to have an interaction with a stranger. But what the students didn't realize is the stranger worked for the experimenter. She was a Confederate. Now, by random assignment, half of the participants were assigned to have an interaction in which this stranger mimicked them just like she normally would anyway. But for the other half of the participants, they were in a situation where they were meeting someone for the first time. And the person that they were meeting, that person was given strict instructions never to mimic the person. So the idea is that this would be exhausting to have an interaction like this. It wouldn't go smoothly. Next, what participants were given was an opportunity to exert self-control. And what the researchers found is that simply by having an interaction in which another person does not mimic you, it's exhausting to have that sort of interaction. And the way that they knew that is that participants struggled to control their impulses. So what these results show us is the importance of self-control in first meeting encounters. And not only the self-control in which we engage, but how other people's behavior can influence our own self-control. When people don't mimic us, it's a signal that something has gone awry, and we try to figure out what's going on. Engaging in this sort of mental exercise can wear us out, and it can have negative consequences for our own self-controlled behavior. Why do we like some people more than others? Now, this question baffles scientists and non-scientists. There are lots of different reasons why we like some people more than others. But one reason might be that some people we simply feel like we gel with. Now, this is a real effect. Think of your best friends. How much energy does it take to be around them? Do you feel a sense of ease and comfort when you're around them? As if you don't have to try to have a good time, to engage in positive activities, or simply a feeling that you can relax and let go and really be yourself. Now think of the people that you avoid. Now, we all have these people in our lives. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. Why is it that you avoid those people? It might be because they're mean or you disagree with them, but it could also simply be that it's very exhausting to be around them. You might think of them as high-maintenance interactions. So is it possible that some people can really wear us out that much? And might this help explain why we avoid some people more than others? Well, let's look at a study that really tested this idea. So what they did was they brought participants into a laboratory and they had them complete an interaction with another person. And this partner worked for the experimenter. And the person who worked for the experimenter, this confederate, they were given some instructions as to whether or not this was supposed to be a high or a low maintenance interaction. So what they had to do was give directions to the participant about how to solve a puzzle. Very simple task, and one that should be very easy to complete. It was easy for them to get on the same page. So for half of the participants, things went extremely smoothly. The partner said left, right, up, down, and so forth. And they were able to complete the task. For the other half of the participants, they were assigned to the high maintenance interaction partner. So they completed the same task, but this time the partner said, go left, right, no, wait. Up, down, left, no. Okay, let's start over. Right, up, down, left, okay. Left, up, okay, I'm screwing this up. Let's start it over again. Up, left, right, you get the picture. So the idea is that that second interaction would wear people out mentally. It would exhaust them. And that's precisely what the researchers found. Across a variety of different measures, whether it was their physical endurance, their mental endurance, or even their logical or reasoning ability, all of these things went down after people had these sorts of high maintenance interactions. So what this shows us is the importance of being easy on others when we're having our relationships. They show that when we gel with other people, that this is a good thing. It might help explain how you can get people to like you. And it can also explain why you avoid some people. Because we only have a limited supply of mental energy to use, it would make sense that we would try to avoid people who are going to sap our energy without our permission. So Be easy on other people. Try to get on the same page with others. And importantly, try to stay there. Because by doing that, you're going to be easier on the other person. They may want to be around you more. And you'll definitely not mentally fatigue them. Why do people use stereotypes? There are a lot of different reasons, and we never want to excuse the use of them. But one way that we can understand why people use stereotypes is that they simplify things. They're a mental conservation strategy. Now, we would hardly be human if we didn't use stereotypes, simply because we're constantly looking for ways to lessen the work that we have to do when we're trying to make sense of our environment. Think of the last time that you went grocery shopping. You were confronted with a lot of different people. And you have a natural propensity, as most humans do, to sort those people into different categories. You sorted them on the basis of their gender, on their age, other sorts of characteristics. That information helped you to understand your environment. It helped you understand who was working and who wasn't working, who were the children and who were the grown-ups. Now I want to give you a situation where I'm going to ask you a very simple question. I'm thinking of a person, and this person loves to play tennis. Now, another thing that he loves to do is he likes to listen to national public radio when he's driving, and he drives a lot. A third thing that he likes to do is read and write poetry. This is one of his biggest passions in life. In fact, when you ask him, what's something that you would love to do if you didn't have your current job, what would it be? He'd say, well, I'd love to be a poet. Now, what does this man do for work? Is he an Ivy League professor, or is he a truck driver? Now, if you're like most people, your answer is Ivy League professor. But if you simply look at the number of Ivy League professors there are in the world, and the number of truck drivers there are in the world, there's a greater probability that the man I just described to you drives trucks for a living. So a lot of times we're using stereotypes to make sense of our world. We have expectations about what other people do, what other people like. And it's this natural propensity that we have to override in order not to use stereotypes sometimes. And this takes self-control. So in one study, European participants sat down in a laboratory. And they were told to write an essay about a day in the life of a person. And they were shown a picture of a young man. Now, crucially, participants were told that this young man was a skinhead. For half of the participants, they were simply told, again, just write an essay about a day in the life of this person. But for the other half of the participants, they were given those instructions, but there was also something added on. They were given explicit instructions not to use any stereotypic information about this person in their essay. If they caught themselves, they're supposed to suppress their use of stereotypes. The idea is that suppressing stereotypes would take a lot of mental energy, and it did. Next to what participants were given were a series of self-control tasks. And across the board, what these results showed is that suppressing stereotypes was depleting, and it impaired later self-control performance. So what these results tell us is that we can have a better understanding about why people use stereotypes, and oftentimes how hard it is not to use them. It takes self-control to override our natural expectations about people, so that instead of thinking about them as members of groups, we think of them as individuals, as unique people who have unique characteristics and experiences that they bring with them to these situations. So although stereotypes help us simplify our lives, we shouldn't live by them, because history is replete with examples of how living by stereotypes can have disastrous consequences. Why are interracial interactions so distressing? We live in a time where there's never been more opportunity to have interactions with people of various backgrounds. Yet when you talk to people, oftentimes they report feeling distress when they're having interracial interactions. Why is that? Well, one reason is people may feel self-conscious. They might feel as if they're going to make a poor impression on the other person, and they might have to engage in more mental energy, more mental work to do that. So if that's true, what are the consequences of having interracial interactions? And might this explain why some people find them especially distressing? Now, to answer this question, one experiment looked at white participants who came into a laboratory and had an interaction with a stranger. For half of these participants, the stranger was also white, a person of the same racial background. For the other half of the participants, the person was an African American. And they had a brief discussion about various topics, including topics related to race. Afterwards, participants completed a self-control task. And this task is what's called the Stroop Color Naming Task. It's one of the most famous self-control tasks in all of psychology. This is the way it works. Participants read a word like the color red. But sometimes they have to ignore the meaning of the word and pay attention to the color in which the word is printed. So imagine reading the word red, but if it's printed in the ink blue, you have to look at the word red and say blue. This takes a lot of self-control energy. And what the researchers hypothesized is that when people have interracial interactions, they're going to be engaging in a lot of self-control during those interactions. And that might have direct implications for their performance on the Stroop task afterwards. And that's precisely what the researchers found. People who had had an interracial interaction, they performed worse on the Stroop task. But crucially, these deficits in self-control were most pronounced among people who are naturally biased in terms of their racial biases. So next, what these researchers did was they wanted to see how the brain works in these sort of situations. What's going on when Caucasian people, when they see African Americans compared to people of their same race? How can this explain why they're experiencing these problems in self-control? So what they did was an fMRI study where they brought participants into a facility where they were shown pictures of Caucasians and pictures of African Americans. During this entire period, they had their brain activity recorded. And what they showed is that these white participants, they engaged in more self-control processes at a neural level when they saw pictures of African Americans. But what's more important is that this brain activation had direct consequences for these participants' later self-control performance. So this gives us some understanding about some of the neural mechanisms underlying why interracial interactions can deplete us of our self-control energy. We engage in more mental work when we're doing them. So how can we have better interracial interactions? Well, one way that we can do this is we can simply have a very clear sense of what we should say and what we shouldn't say in them. In fact, one study showed that if you simply give white participants a script of what to say in their interracial interactions, suddenly they're not as mentally fatigued later on. So I'm not saying that we should bring scripts with us into our interactions with other people. We wouldn't want to do that. But one thing that we can do is think carefully about things we want to say and things that we don't want to say when we're having interracial interactions. By having a clear script in our heads about what we want to say, we might be less likely to fall prey to some of these deficits in self-control that have been observed in these psychological studies. And the hope is that when people approach interracial interactions, they won't experience as much distress and anxiety. When does it pay to be mentally exhausted? We've been talking about all sorts of negative consequences of being fatigued, but there have got to be some positive things to it. Think about some interactions that you've had with other people, where they're constantly trying too hard. They're trying too hard to control what they're saying, what they're doing, maybe even what they're feeling. What's it like to have interactions with these people? Sometimes it can be frustrating. They don't seem genuine. They might even seem like they're extremely high maintenance, like they're not really going to let you know what they think deep down. Now, recently, some investigators have explored this question within the context of interracial interactions. Now, many times when people are having interracial interactions, there's a sense that people are trying too hard to make a good impression. And this can rub people the wrong way. So what these researchers did was something quite brilliant. What they did was they brought some Caucasian students into the laboratory and they sat them down. Next, what they did was they had these participants complete a task, and for half of them, this task was extremely mentally exhausting. For the other half, it didn't wear them out that much. So what the researchers really wanted to do is to mentally fatigue half of these participants before they had an interracial interaction. So next what they did was they had a stranger come into the laboratory room. And this stranger actually worked for the experimenter. Next, what this person did was they simply had an interaction talking about various things, including issues related to race relations. Afterwards, what they did was they had participants get ratings on how well they did during this interaction from their partner. So what do you think that these researchers found? Who was better off in making a good impression in this interracial interaction? People who had all of their mental energy to make a good impression, or people who were a little bit more mentally exhausted, who simply didn't have lots of energy to spend in trying to make a good impression? The results were clear. Participants who were mentally fatigued going into this interracial interaction were perceived more positively. They were perceived as less prejudiced and more direct. So this is some of the first evidence about the benefits of being mentally exhausted. It's not a good idea to try to make a good impression using all of your mental energy because you come off as less genuine than you really are. But there are other times when being low in mental energy might be a good thing. Think of romantic relationships or even friendships. Sometimes your partner is going to offend you. what's going to predict whether or not you're going to forgive them? Well, mental energy can give you some answer. So, if this offense is extremely severe, if your partner really makes you angry, that's one thing. But most offenses aren't like that. Most of the time when our relationship partners upset us, they're extremely minor transgressions. And when people are mentally exhausted, a lot of times they are simply too tired to get into a fight. When there's a minor offense, it's not that big of a deal. And when people are fatigued, they simply don't have the energy to get into an argument. So these are a couple examples of when it pays to be mentally exhausted. When you're approaching an interaction that you might be nervous about, it might be important to think about the level of mental energy that you have going into it and trying not to use all of it, because by doing that, you might not appear genuine. And when it comes to your close relationships, think carefully about when your partner offends you. If it's a minor offense and you're very fatigued, a lot of times it simply won't pay to get into the argument. How can we become less reliant on stereotypes and avoid some of the pitfalls of having depleted mental energy? Well, let's talk about 3 simple ways that are scientifically validated that we can use. The first thing that we can do is simply become more aware of the mental energy that we're expending. Become a better mental energy accountant. Look at your daily activities and keep track of which of them are going to require lots of self-control and others that will not. By becoming aware of when you're going to spend self-control and when you're not going to, you can know and plan your interactions around the time when you're fully rested. So for the next week, again, keep track of your activities, but also keep track of the energy that you plan to expend in those activities. The next step is to look at the interactions that you're going to be having. And if you think that you're going to have an interaction where you need to use self-control, plan accordingly. What you'll find is that your interactions will go a lot more smoothly. And it's possible that you might not fall prey to many of the negative consequences we've seen that follow interracial interactions. Another way that we can improve the interactions that we're having and become less reliant on stereotypes is to build up our self-control strength. Now, one group of studies tested this possibility of whether you can actually do this. And they randomly assigned participants to practice self-control in various ways or not to practice self-control. Some of these tasks involved using your non-dominant hand for everyday activities, sitting up straight, speaking in complete sentences, things that we can all do, but oftentimes we have to exert self-control to do them. And what these studies showed is that participants who practiced self-control simply for 2 weeks, they became less reliant on stereotypes, especially in conditions when they were mentally fatigued. So what I would encourage you to do over the next 2 weeks is to practice self-control using some of these activities. Become very aware of your speech. Try to use complete sentences. Sit up straight instead of slouching. Use your non-dominant hand for everyday activities. What you'll find is that these sorts of activities, although they might seem very unrelated to your use of stereotypes, it will help you because you'll have more strength at your disposal. So that when you're confronted with situations that might stress you out, you'll have a better ability to approach that situation with strength, with self-control. And by doing that, not only will you have a greater sense of accomplishment after having your interaction, but you might also make a better impression on the other person. And maybe even have won a new friend. What's the most stressful part of getting married? Now, many of us have asked this very question, and there are lots of different answers. Maybe it's, where should you have your wedding? How much should you spend on your wedding? What sort of food should you have at your wedding? Or who should you invite, and who do you have to exclude? But there's another stressor that many people don't talk about when it comes to planning a wedding, and that's registering for your presence. Now, a friend of mine told me about her experience several years ago. And what she said was that when she and her then fiancé went to a big store, they were given a tool that resembled a gun. And what they did was they spent hours making hundreds upon hundreds of decisions. They had to make decisions such as, do we want these forks or these forks? Do we want these bed sheets that have this color and this thread count, or these other bedroom sheets? What sort of theme do we want our kitchen to have? And what sort of theme do we want our bathrooms to have? What she said was that by the end of those hours, she would have said yes to anything because she was completely mentally wiped out. She was exhausted. She had become depleted of her self-control energy. Scientific studies have backed this up. When you ask people to make decisions, what happens is they have to use self-control to do that. And by making decisions, it depletes people's self-control energy, and it impairs their ability to control their impulses later on. So if this is true, if depleting our self-control energy happens when we make decisions, then how can we offset those deficits? Well, one way that you may have thought of is simply to make decisions that you enjoy making, that give you positive emotions. And that's true. When people enjoy making the decisions that they're making, they aren't as mentally fatiguing, up to a certain point. Even if you're making decisions that you enjoy, over time, it's going to wear you out. It's going to make you mentally exhausted. So one thing that this helps us understand is how people make decisions and how people actually begin to enjoy the decisions that they make. Because making decisions takes a lot of mental energy, it helps us understand why people are more satisfied with the decisions that they make when there are fewer options available to them. Now, this is counterintuitive. When you ask people if they want to have more options, most of the time people will say yes. When I go into a coffee shop, I want to have lots of different options. When I go to a grocery store, I want to have many options for buying all of the different products that my family and I enjoy. But the reality is much different. By narrowing your choices, by narrowing your options, you're going to be more satisfied. And one reason for that is because you're going to be less exhausted. So this helps us explain what goes on in the decision-making process. Self-control is involved. So next time you're going to make a decision, target decisions that you enjoy making and limit your options to 2 or 3 or 4 possibilities. What you'll find is you'll make better decisions. You'll be more satisfied with the decisions that you make, and you're going to have more mental energy left over. And what that means is you're not going to suffer many of the pitfalls that we all experience when we're mentally fatigued. How does self-control affect your money? Well, it can affect it in a couple of different ways. One way that we can understand this question is simply going back to understanding what self-control is and how it works. One component of self-control is monitoring, keeping track of your thoughts, your feelings, and behaviors. And this is extremely important when it comes to your money. People who keep close watch on how much money they have and how much money they spend are better able to achieve financial success, to meet their financial goals. Now, it seems common sense, but lots of people don't do this. And fortunately, through technology, it's never been easier to keep track of how much money you have and how much you spend. Logging online through your computer, even getting on a cell phone using an app, all of these things can help us exert self-control over how much money we spend. Standards also help us understand the link between self-control and money. Remember that standards are guidelines that are set before us that tell us what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. These standards can come to mind when we're making decisions about our money. If we're making a decision that's going to undermine our personal or societal standards for what's appropriate, we might change our behavior so that we can do what's in agreement with that standard. But another factor of self-control can influence the decisions that we make when it comes to our money, and that's self-control strength. When people are depleted of their self-control strength, it influences their monetary decisions in a couple of different ways. In one series of studies, what researchers did was they brought participants into a laboratory and they had half of them complete some tasks that depleted them of their self-control energy, and the other half of the participants were not depleted of their self-control energy. And they did this in a variety of different ways. Next, what the researchers did was they wanted to see how much participants would spend of some money. Imagine going to an auction and you see something that you want. You have an urge to buy it. But then what happens is someone else starts bidding on that, and the price goes up and up. These researchers created a situation that mimicked that very scenario at an auction. And what they showed was that when people were depleted of their self-control energy, they were willing to pay more and more for the same product compared to people whose self-control energy had not been depleted. But that's not the only connection between self-control strength and monetary decisions. When people are depleted of their self-control energy, they will simply spend more of their money on just about anything. It doesn't matter if the goods are high quality or low quality, if they're healthy or unhealthy. With a limited amount of self-control energy that we have, when that becomes compromised, people simply make more impulsive decisions. Now, one important factor to consider is it's not only that when people are depleted of their self-control energy that these things happen, but it also depends on whether people are naturally inclined to make impulsive financial decisions. When you combine these two different factors of being mentally fatigued or exhausted and already being the type of person who makes impulsive financial decisions, those two factors create a perfect storm that will predispose you to make very unwise financial decisions. So most of the problems that people have when it comes to self-control and money are often with not regulating themselves that much, under-regulation. But this isn't the only time that self-control can get you into problems surrounding your money. Think of people that over-regulate. Now, one example that I like to think of is the example of Hetty Green. Now, she is a very good example of over-regulation of her finances. Now, it paid off handsomely for her financially. When she died, she was worth what is the equivalent of billions of dollars in modern day currency. But when you look at the consequences of that on her life, they weren't always that positive. So she led a very simple life, but maybe it was a little bit too simple. It had negative consequences on some of her relationships. For example, when her husband was having financial difficulties and she had plenty of money to help him out, she refused to do that, and it seriously compromised her relationship. So the important thing to remember here is that self-control is often a very good thing when it comes to the financial decisions that we make, but balance is also something that we have to keep in mind. By keeping both of these things in check, exerting self-control, but doing so in a way that doesn't undermine our relationships, we can get the benefits of making wise financial decisions and of having positive and lasting relationships. What are the great mysteries of the universe? The origin of the world? When did humans begin to have consciousness? Well, when I tell people that I'm a psychologist, they often don't ask me those questions. The most common question that they ask is, how can I have a good relationship? Well, let's think about that. Think about the trait that you prize the most in a close relationship partner, whether it's a friend or even a romantic partner. Now, there are lots of things that we look for. Maybe we want someone who has similar interests, someone who's humorous, someone with whom we feel safe. But another thing that we can think about is we want someone who can control their impulses, who can fulfill their promises, someone that we can depend on, who will be there for us, even when the times get difficult. So, how might this play out in our relationships? Is self-control really that good of a thing? And if so, what are some examples about when it can be good? And are there examples about when it can backfire? Well, one way that we can think of this is to imagine a scenario. So you come home from a long day at the office, nobody understood what you were trying to do, you're frustrated, you had some anger on the way home, and you just want some support. As soon as you get home, your romantic partner meets you at the door, looks at you and says, "Did you really wear that to the office today? You look awful." Now, what are you going to do? What's going to help to predict whether you're going to forgive your partner or if you're not going to forgive your partner? Well, in that sort of situation, most people would have an urge to lash out at their partner, and that's just a natural part of being human. But what comes between that urge and lashing out at your partner is self-control. And what scientific studies have shown is that people who have better self-control are able to override their impulse to lash out at their partners. They're more forgiving. And when you deplete people of their mental energy, when you stress them out, when you make them feel mentally exhausted, they become less able to control their impulses, and they become less forgiving. Now, this line of reasoning is not only true at a psychological level, it's also true at a biological level. So people who have deficiencies in breaking down their metabolic energy, they also tend to be less forgiving. People who have elevated symptoms of diabetes, who don't break down glucose efficiently into amino acids, into energy, they also have problems forgiving close relationship partners. So that's one way that we can understand a link between self-control and relationship success. But another way that we can look at it is simply who tend to be the most satisfied people out there in terms of their close relationships. Now, there are three different hypotheses that we can entertain when it comes to self-control and relationship satisfaction. One of them is that birds of a feather will flock together. So the more similar two people are in terms of their level of self-control, the better their relationship will be. The more satisfied people will be, the more committed they will be. Another possibility is that dissimilarity will be a good thing, that opposites should attract, that it's much better for someone with very high self-control to pair up with someone with very low self-control, so that they can balance each other out. But the third possibility is the total amount of self-control in a relationship paying off the most. That when you think of two members of a relationship, the more self-control that those two people have, the better off they're going to be. And that's precisely what you find. Whether it's with your friends, with your dating partners, or even when you look at people who are married. People who report the highest level of satisfaction in those relationships tend to have the highest level of self-control in that relationship. The more that you and your partner have high levels of self-control, the better off your relationship is. And it's not just with satisfaction. It also increases commitment. And this can help us understand some key findings when we look at the relationship between self-control and other relationship outcomes. So we've seen that having good self-control reduces the likelihood of divorce. But there's also recent evidence that people who have self-control that's operating at a very high level, they also are less likely to do things that might lead to a divorce, such as engaging in infidelity. So what these findings all point to is a general conclusion that if you're looking for a close relationship partner, there are lots of different traits that you can go after. But among the most important in predicting relationship success is whether or not that person has high levels of self-control. Relationships take work. So we have to ask ourselves, why do we have them in the first place? Well, one main reason is because we're kind of hardwired to have relationships. We have a fundamental need for positive and lasting relationships. Now, this need to belong is deeply rooted in our evolutionary history and has all sorts of consequences for modern psychological processes. But one main benefit that we get from having close relationships with other people is it frees us up. We don't have to do everything for ourselves. We're able to outsource certain things in our lives to our close relationship partners. Now, all of us do this without even thinking about it. We outsource a lot of our daily lives to our culture. Very few people cook and grow everything that they eat. Very few people make all of the clothes that they wear. And even fewer people construct the homes or the apartments in which they live. We depend on other people to do this for us. And by outsourcing those activities to other people, we're able to fulfill other goals in our lives. This is true at a one-on-one level. When we think of our close relationship partners, like our romantic partners, they also help to fulfill this role. So to explore this possibility scientifically, researchers have begun to bring people who are in relationships into the laboratory and to expose them to different situations to see if you get this outsourcing effect. So in one study, what they did was they brought participants who were all involved in romantic relationships into the laboratory. By random assignment, they depleted half of them of their self-control energy. They had them complete a self-control task that was specifically designed to wear them out mentally. The other half of the participants had an easier time of it. they completed a similar task that did not require self-control. But the trick came next. For half of these participants, the experimenters had them list a goal, a fitness-related goal. And they asked them about whether their partner helped them achieve that goal. For the other half of the participants, they were not given this opportunity to think of a goal that their partner helped them with. Next, what the researchers did was they asked participants how much they expected to exert effort and self-control in that specific domain in which their partner helped them or where their partner did not help them. And what they found very consistently is that people outsource their goals to their romantic partners. And when they do this, they're less likely to report wanting to expend effort themselves. Now, this effect was most pronounced among people who were already at a deficit of mental energy. So when people are already mentally exhausted, and they know that their partner is going to help them complete the goal in the first place, they are less motivated to expend much energy on their own. Now, what function might outsourcing serve? Well, the next step looked at this question, and what they found was that outsourcing not only makes people more judicious about the energy that they spend, but it increases commitment to that relationship partner. Now, it makes sense why that might happen. If I know that I can depend on my relationship partner to help me complete various goals in my life, I might come to rely on them and to become more committed to my relationship to them. Because instead of having to do everything on my own, now I can reap the benefits of having help. And by doing that, I'm going to be better able to achieve other goals, maybe even goals that I haven't even thought of yet. So this is one reason why people have a fundamental need for relationships. They make us feel happy, but they also allow us to conserve our mental energy so that we can achieve many different goals. Now that we've learned about the relationships between self-control, money, and relationships, now let's consider some practical activities that we can use to apply this knowledge in our everyday lives. The first thing that we can do is become mindful when it comes to making major relationship decisions. Now, we all have to make these, and sometimes they can be very stressful. What I would encourage you to do is when you have to make these major relationship decisions, don't do that when you're mentally exhausted. Think very carefully about how much mental energy you have, how much stress you're under, and if it's more important for you to get it done now, or if you can wait and sleep on it. By waiting until you have a sufficient amount of mental energy on board, you're a lot more likely to make a logical decision, something you aren't going to regret later. The second activity that I like for you to do comes to how we communicate with other people. Now, email and text messaging are two very easy ways that we can get in touch with people, and this is often a very good thing. But sometimes we send messages that we wish that we hadn't sent. We say things that we wish we hadn't. So what I'd like for you to do over the next week is to simply do a simple experiment with yourself by not sending an email or text message after 10 p.m. when you're most mentally exhausted. By keeping in mind the importance of having sufficient mental energy to communicate with other people, you may see that you're less likely to send messages that you will regret later. But another benefit of this is that you might sleep more soundly because you know that you're not even in need of reading any emails or text messages that you receive because you can't respond to them anyway. So a third activity that we can do related to self-control in relationships and other decision-making processes is limiting the options that you have. So we've seen that people are most satisfied with the decisions that they make when they have just 2 or 3 or 4 different options at their fingertips. So what I'd like for you to do is think about the activities that you're going to be doing over the next week and make a strategic plan of attack for activities where you know that you're going to have to exert a lot of self-control. If you're going to a restaurant and you're worried about what you're going to order, if it's going to be healthy or unhealthy, look at the menu ahead of time. Narrow the options down to your favorite 2, 3, or 4 dishes. And by doing that, you're going to be more likely to make a decision that's going to be in line with your goals. So these are 3 simple activities that we can use to apply our knowledge of self-control and how it can improve the decisions that we make in our relationships. In this course, you've learned about your greatest inner strength and the easiest one to improve, self-control. What I hope that you've gained is an understanding that it doesn't matter where you're starting. We all have problems with self-control, but we can all improve our self-control. We can start small, making incremental steps. And by doing that, we're going to be able to achieve our goals. One way that we can do this is simply by changing our environment and changing the way that we think about our environment. So oftentimes, people feel as though they're on the defense, that there are constantly things that are approaching them, that are tempting them to do things that they know are going to undermine their goals. What I would encourage you to do is to begin to play offense against your environment. When you look at the most successful people when it comes to their ability to control their impulses, a lot of times what these people look like are just like you and me. But the key difference is that they've changed their environment to relieve them of things that might tempt them, that might throw them off track. So the next time that you find yourself having gone off track, don't sweat it. You'd be hardly human if you didn't have problems with self-control. We all do. It's a difficult, often painful process. But also keep in mind that you can start small, that you should never give up, that you should never stop believing that you can achieve goals that seem even far out there. Things that you think aren't possible for you are possible because you have the inner strength that will make all the difference in the world. You have self-control. And so this is something that I've also included in my own life. As someone who loves to write, I use self-control to become a better writer. I allot time in my daily routine so that I'm sure to get my hours in every single day. And I've built this up over years of practice. I also apply it to my life in terms of my fitness goals. I love to run. I love to exercise. But I have to exert self-control to do that. I have to set specific plans for myself so that I can achieve my goals. Whether it's running a 5K, a half marathon, a marathon, or even an ultra marathon. I have to follow a routine, a schedule that will help me to achieve this goal. So we all have what it takes to achieve our goals. Although we might not think that we're just like the people whose self-control we might idolize, we share more in common with those people than we might think. We have an inner strength that will help make that possible. And that inner strength is self-control.